doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm Lizzie. I'm with Central Alabama Voice. I'm here with Andy Jackson, who was recently named Teacher of the Year in Alabama. Congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So first of all, tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about your teaching background, where you work currently and where you've been, kind of how you got there.
So my teaching background, I'm going to start in North Dakota, where I grew up in Fargo, North Dakota. And my grandparents, I was raised by my grandparents, and they had several foster children, biological children. I didn't realize aunts and uncles who were adopted versus foster versus biological until I was like 23 years old.
Right.
So I grew up there, so my grandparents always had a philosophy of, help people. The home is an open place. They were active in, the church groups and that sort of thing.
Awesome.
So I kind of had a feeling I wanted to do something in that realm. And I had an opportunity in the Boy Scouts. I was an Eagle Scout back in the day. Well, I guess once an Eagle, always an Eagle is the same.
Yes.
But so that was kind of where I learned, if you can make one of your peers want to wash dishes on a camp out, you can do pretty much anything.
Yeah.
And so I did that, and I loved the leadership aspect, and I loved the teaching aspect. And so I went to college at Samford, and it turned into hey, I really like this. Now at Samford, they had a program called ESEC, which stands for Early Childhood Education, Special Education, Elementary Education, Collaborative Education. It was basically a program that allowed you to teach elementary education, special education, pretty much everything in the child. I had not considered special education at all.
Okay.
And it's funny because that's kind of where now my passion and my interest lies. Yeah. And so at Samford, it became you teach kids, period. It's not, well, I teach special ed, I teach general education, I teach. And so I started and I graduated from there.
Cool.
I went to McAdory Elementary in Jefferson County for a year. I was at Glenwood, which is a state-supported special ed program in Birmingham, for a year.
Okay.
And then I went to Pell City, and I've taught at the middle school level in Pell City doing special ed. I taught elementary special ed, and now I teach fourth grade currently.
At Eden Elementary.
Correct.
Awesome. So before we get into that, I do want to touch on, because I'm really passionate about, as our listeners know, people who aren't from here but have come here and built their family here, their business here, whatever, because I'm not from here. I'm originally from Virginia by way of Pennsylvania, so I'm kind of a northerner too. So how did you end up in Alabama? I mean, why did you come down south?
I ended up in Alabama, I would say by accident. Most people would probably, I think some more divine at work there, but so in Thanksgiving, my senior year of high school, I went to a private school, and they were very big on, if you're going to go somewhere, please visit a college. Make sure you don't waste time. So we went to Thanksgiving down here to visit my aunt and uncle. My uncle was actually a music minister at the Lighthouse Community Church in Harpersville, which is not too far from here.
Right.
So I'd never been here, but we had gone and stayed with them for a few days, and he had gone to Samford.
Okay.
And so we went, I visited Samford. It was good. I enjoyed it, but we didn't really have any family around here. And so I went home, felt a nagging feeling I was supposed to be in Alabama. So I sent an application into Samford 2 weeks late so that I could say, I really wanted to go to Alabama too. But figuring that things maybe wouldn't work. Well, it turned out they did, and they called and they said, hey, we got your application. Are you going to come to Samford? Well, at that point, my aunt and uncle were in the process of moving. They moved to Georgia. So that means there was nobody that I knew here. The only things I knew were what I learned in history class. And so,
which aren't always great things.
No, not
don't hear great things
not
about
great things
Alabama
at all. And so I was like, I'm not sure this is going to work for me. But I kind of stepped out and took kind of a leap of faith and went to Samford. Loved it. Connected with several great people in the area. Graduated. And I was going to actually go back to North Dakota. That was always my plan.
Right.
My master's degree is from the University of North Dakota, because I figured if I went back up to North Dakota, nobody knows where Samford is. Oh, do you mean Stanford?
Right.
No, I mean Samford.
Samford, yeah.
So at that point, I graduated and was offered it's called a resident teacher, somebody who's working on their master's degree who teaches in North Dakota.
Okay.
And it's kind of a guaranteed, 99% acceptance rate.
So similar to a doctor.
So I was offered to teach there, and I was offered McAdory in Jefferson County.
Okay.
And I was torn, although I really wasn't. I knew where I was supposed to be. So I asked my grandmother, and I said, so what do I do? And she says, well, I think you know where you're supposed to be, or you wouldn't be asking. And it's not comfortable, but if you go away from where you're supposed to be, you're not going to fulfill your purpose.
Yeah.
And so that ended up being my purpose. I've been here ever since.
Yeah.
Like I said, have a family, actually a child who I've adopted, who kind of started my foster care adoption journey. Was in my class my first year at McAdory. I taught him.
Oh, cool.
So everything kind of came full circle, and it ended up being kind of the right place at the right time.
That's awesome. It is interesting how kind of you end up here. I came down for a job interview, was here for 2 or 3 days, and I was like, it just feels right. You know, when you know, you
absolutely.
know, you know,
Absolutely.
and I think Alabama has that draw. So, so tell me a little bit more about winning Teacher of the Year and what that meant to you and why you think you were nominated and what the process was like and what it meant to you.
Absolutely. So the process kind of started back in November. And so back in November, each school kind of selects a Teacher of the Year, and they have different procedures, different, but essentially it's parents or students or faculty that nominate a teacher. And then it's just kind of you go until you don't go to the next round.
Right.
So it was in November, I submitted an application, and then I found out in January that I was the school system Teacher of the Year, kind of the representative for the school system.
Right.
Well, normally in a traditional year, they announce kind of the top 16 Teachers of the Year, and they submit a video and a headshot and a few other things in April. And then they narrow that to 4. And then those 4 are interviewed typically in early May. And then in mid-May, they announced the Teacher of the Year.
Right.
Well, this year, I
Wasn't
didn't
the typical
hear
year.
anything. We didn't hear anything in April. We didn't hear anything in May. So I thought,
Right.
well, maybe they just decided not to do it. So
Right.
it was, I think, the last day in May, or one of the last days in May, I was cleaning out my classroom. And I get a call from somebody at the State Department, and they're like, hey, you're in the top 16 for Teacher of the Year. And I was like, that's cool. I didn't know this was a thing we were still doing.
Right.
So I got a headshot and a few things that they needed. And then, kind of things went quiet. It was summer break, didn't hear much. And then I get a call from the state superintendent the middle of July. And they're like, hey, you're in the top 4. You're going to interview with a committee of about 12 panelists that represent different school systems. They represent different organizations, different community organizations, administration, just kind of all across the board, a pretty well represented, diverse group. So they interview, and then they select their Teacher of the Year. So I interviewed July 30th. I remember because I was in Fargo, North Dakota. I interviewed in a conference room at a hotel. And so at that point, I still didn't hear anything. I was anxious because school was about to start.
Right.
And so, but August 13th was when they announced it. I probably shouldn't say this, but I just think it's funny. So I was dressed, appropriately, professionally, at least from what the Zoom audience could see. I had gym shorts on the bottom with my suit coat on the top.
Thing, yeah.
And I heard my name announced, and it was just weird. It was like, I almost wasn't sure that
it was real.
You heard it. You
Yeah.
were like, well, that's because, of course, you play different scenarios in your head of what's going to happen.
Right.
And you hear it, and you're just like, oh. And the next 4 hours after that were a blur. There were so many different calls and people and texts, and I hope I got to everybody. I know I missed people. But then it turned to, I was supposed to start school August 14th. So I was supposed to teach. I was supposed to report to Teacher Institute to teach that following day.
Right.
And so it became a challenge of, with everything else going on, what does my position look like? And this has been, it's a little different than most years. There's a little bit less travel, at least on the front end, just because a lot of schools are closed and things like that. But it's a position where there is a lot of opportunity to travel and to speak to different places. And so it's, so far, the way I would describe it is busy enough to where I can't work a full-time job consistently, but not busy enough for me to feel like I'm busy.
Right.
So that was kind of where they started. And so then we created, and there's, the year started, and I've kind of helped them transition. But it's just kind of been a blur. Everything happened so fast.
So
we
quickly,
went from...
That's how this year has been, right?
Well, it has, and it went from, you're always hitting a moving target, because every time you think you know kind of what the plans are, new data pops up or a new situation that you hadn't considered. And so you kind of have to adjust to that. So we were adjusting, and I said it was the day before I was supposed to go back. So for all intents and purposes, I said, I'm going to teach. This is what I'm going to do this year.
Right.
And then when that happened, everything just kind of turned upside down, both for myself and for my wonderful colleagues at Eden Elementary, who are fantastic, who stepped in and were very supportive. And I work in, I think the greatest school in Alabama, but certainly for the greatest system. I think we have a lot of great things going for us. And so it was just kind of, like I said, surreal to hear. And then it was kind of the crushing blow of all the logistics of, well, what's going to happen? We have a child that has some pretty severe special needs that make it a challenge to be too far away to give him time. And so it became the logistics of, okay, what's school going to look like? Okay, what's work going to look like? What's school going to look like? And that's finally now starting to settle. And I think things are starting to settle into a groove of kind of what things are going to be from this point forward.
And just for our listeners that don't know, the Teacher of the Year typically takes the year off, the following year off, to go around and speak or mentor, or kind of what does that year typically look like?
The year kind of typically, it varies really.
Okay.
It's kind of up to the teacher. How busy they want to be, how involved they want to be. There's a lot of, I don't want to say self-marketing, but if you speak somewhere and you're not super inspiring or you don't connect with, you may not be asked to speak by anybody in that organization again. So it's kind of hit and miss, and some teachers are more comfortable, doing more in their classrooms, and the opportunities present themselves for them to kind of be more at home.
Okay.
And others take the chance. I talked to Miss Jennifer Brown, teacher in Vestavia Hills, who was the Teacher of the Year a few years ago, and she, just hearing her stories, toured the state and went to different schools and got to see different administrators in different classrooms, and that was really cool. So it's kind of a
make it your own.
Make it your own, and you kind of connect with the people and the places that have your passions.
Right.
So she had said she was really interested in science, and I hope I'm paraphrasing here. If Miss Brown is listening, I hope she doesn't get super offended, but she wanted to look at who's doing things that are new and innovative and doing kind of scientific. My passion is foster care, adoption, mental health awareness. And so kind of the organizations that you tend to go to, certainly some are educational, some may be committees at the state level, but then some are kind of related to your passion projects.
And your own personal and professional development, I would assume.
And that gets into, your previous question that I didn't fully answer about why I was nominated. That's a weird question. I
was going to ask you, what do you think your qualifications were? So, brag about yourself a little bit.
On paper, whether rightly or wrongly, on paper, I look interesting because it's not common to have a male elementary teacher in Alabama. It's not common to have. I have a national board certificate. It's not it's not common for a teacher to have a doctorate at the elementary level in the classroom. And so to have a doctorate, to have a national board, to be a male, there was already kind of, not necessarily better than anybody, but different things that I brought to the table than maybe somebody else did.
Yeah, and you just stand out. I've been a judge of these contests before, and you're kind of like, when you see the same thing over and over again, but then it's suddenly like, oh, that's different.
And I think that was it. And then I think
eye-catching.
We have 8 kids, several adopted from foster care. We provide foster care right now to a little toddler. And then I think that in kind of coinciding with my mental health, my passion for my mental health advocacy, my passion for mental health awareness, I think those things, again, we're not necessarily better or more deserving than what anybody else had. They were just maybe, like I said, they were maybe different or they were maybe something that the committee hadn't seen quite as often.
Right.
And so I think that's maybe how that ended up.
So I'm glad you brought up national board certification. So I come from a family of teachers. My mom's an elementary teacher. My dad was a college professor. My stepdad's a college professor. So I come from
But you're not teaching.
No, but that's my life goal, though. I always say by the time I'm, 10 years from now, that's what I want to be doing. Go back and get a master's and teach. But my mom is really passionate about national board certification. She lives in Montana. It's the same way. It's not really common for teachers in Montana, especially at elementary level, to have national board certifications. Why do you think that's important? How do we get more teachers going through that process?
Well, and Alabama, good news for Alabama, we are among, speaking here, but I want to say we were in the top 3 maybe in growth percentage of national board. So Alabama is really trying to make a push at the state level for sure to say, hey, this is important, we need this. There's a push, like I said, at the state level, and the reason for that, I think, is all teacher programs have nuances. They all have different, kind of skills and different, and so national board certification is a way for them to say this is the standard by which we're measuring people across the state. And so I think, like I said, it's beginning to be more common. I'm running into more and more people in Alabama with a national board certification. And a lot of our teachers of the year in the past have had national board certifications. And it requires a lot of self-reflection. It requires a lot of looking kind of introspectively at your teaching, at your practice. Unfortunately, it sometimes requires checking your pride at the door and recognizing, hey, there's things that can be done better. There's things that maybe I've done it this way, but it's not maybe the most effective way. And so I think that's important just because it says you're continuing to work. One of our school board members, Tammy Williams is her name, she always quotes, and I think it's a Rory Vaden quote initially, but it's success is never owned, success is rented, and the rent is due every day. And I think that's kind of my thought behind what makes national boards so important, is that it is teachers who say, look, I've been teaching for a while, but there's a way for me to improve.
Do better.
There's a way for me to pay my rent today to continue to have success. And I think it's like any system, it's not perfect. It has, certain, flaws or things that maybe could be improved. But as far as a national certification process, it's good. And there are certain, like I said, traits that you see from these teachers that excel. You see teachers that can communicate. You see teachers that are introspective. You see teachers that are focused on student learning. And those traits, even though they look different maybe in different teachers with different personalities, those traits are important. And I think the biggest thing is always wanting to improve and not being willing to say, hey, I'm a teacher, I have my certification, I'm done.
Yeah, and I think, and this is probably across many professions, like even in media, things change, The way that kids learn change, technology changes, the way that we, now have the world at our fingertips. Obviously that's much different than it was even 10 years ago when I started. So having that ability to kind of, like you said, be introspective.
Well, and I think that's where education is going to be okay. When you look at something kind of in the moment, it's hard to see, but I don't consider myself to be old. I don't think 33 is super old, maybe it is. But I look at, I'm telling my students about these chalkboards and these things called overhead projectors.
And they don't have those anymore,
what? So education has changed from a technology perspective. Education has changed from a service delivery model. One of my kids is in Alabama Virtual Academy and doing very well there. That's been a great fit for him. Virtual schools and things that we didn't have back then. The heart of education is the same, teaching children. But the methods and kind of as we adapt, and that's where popped in the middle of a pandemic where there is some challenges and there is some frustration, but I think it's going to be, in the moment, it looks like, oh my goodness, how is this going to happen? This is going to shape education forever. And I think it will, but I think just like every other major change that's happened, introducing a Chromebook. I have students who have a Chromebook, every student, so we can put things on the internet. That was impossible 5 years ago, 6 years ago in our system. And so I think, just like anything else, looking back, we're going to see this pandemic as look at the ways that we innovated, look at the lessons we learned, maybe some the hard way, but I think moving forward, things will be better. I always think back to, I don't know if you remember that snow day, like 4 years ago now, 5 years, it was a while ago.
Might be before I was even here.
How long have you been here?
3.5 years.
Oh, it was before you were here.
Yeah.
But they were like, oh, it's going to be a light dusting of snow. So school stayed in session. And it snowed, it just crazy. In a span of an hour, roads were not drivable. Schools were having to have students spend the night because buses couldn't run.
Wow.
But even something, looking back on that now, we look at, oh yeah, well, we learned from that and schools have made severe weather plans because of that.
Right.
But in the moment, it was like, oh my goodness, how are we going to fix this?
Yeah.
What are we? And I think looking back at this in the future, we're going to say, okay, that's what we learned.
Right.
That's what not to do. But it is frustrating in the moment as we're trying to navigate, and everybody's got different situations. Working parents who have a job that they can't necessarily work from home, and their kids need to have a place to go and need to be learning. And some kids learn better in person. My son, or actually several of my sons have special needs and do better learning in person. My daughters enjoy the in-person aspect because they're very social.
Right.
They can learn online, but they don't prefer it. But there are certain kids that you can't deliver that instruction online in the same format.
Yeah, I do think it's difficult because everybody's situation, like you alluded to, everybody's situation is different. So it's hard to judge who's doing what right or wrong at this point because it is difficult. But I do want to switch gears just a little bit because you have mentioned your kids, which is great. So tell me a little bit about your history with adoption, your history with your kids, how your family has become your family.
I started I want to say by myself, but my first year out of college, I was going to save the world, like most newly graduated teachers are about want to do.
Right.
And so we had a student who, again, I can talk more candidly about this because he's my child. I don't have to get privacy permissions to discuss my child's history. But he came into care. He had not been in preschool, or came into school, I should say, had not been in pre-K or daycare or anything.
Okay.
And had some behavioral challenges, and we saw some things that were concerning and made a call to child services, and he was taken out of his home. Well, at that point, I was, still kind of checking in, and they said, hey, he's, kind of been shuffled around a few nights, trying to find a place to go.
Right.
And so I thought, well, I'll just become a foster parent. Well, no, apparently, because he had special needs, the magic age in Alabama is 25. Which I understand in hindsight that, dealing with that level of child at 22 or even 33 or whenever
any age,
is challenging. But I got into it because he was in a different situation. And so I said, well, let me become a foster parent in the hopes of helping him, that child. So I went through the process, and I've got some stories that about DHR, the good and quite a bit of the bad that I could share. I had an attorney at one point going against, it was crazy.
Yeah.
But I got my foster care license, and I had a few kids that came to live with me, one of which his name was Jacob, and he's been with me now he was adopted in 2012.
Oh, wow.
He came to live with me in 2010. So he was kind of my first kid. But I'd had kind of kids that I'd fostered, I should say, not adopted, and taken care of as a single parent for several years, with Jacob as kind of the adopted child.
Right.
And so at that point, I was looking on the website, the Heart Gallery Alabama, which is a website for adoptive families, and had seen that child need a home. I found out at that point that he had since been in, since that time he was 5, had been in like 17 different foster care placements, including one placement for 2 years. So 3 of those years were spent in 16 different spots. And there was a family that was going to kind of complete the process for adoption, and then things happened and they maybe decided that wasn't where they were wanting to go, but they kept siblings. It was a messy situation.
Right.
And I was always told, are you sure that this is the child? He's got so many issues. We have so many other kids here that you should look into.
Right.
And so that was kind of where my passion started. So I adopted Jacob, I adopted Eric, and then was still fostering and taking care of kids. And then my wife, who is also a phenomenal teacher. This is her first year teaching, but the type of person she is, she's going to be a teacher. She was in nonprofit for a long time. With the Community Foundation of Greater Birmingham. I hope I didn't mess that up. But like working with grants and nonprofits, and she's brilliant. And she decided she wanted to teach. So it's never too late to teach.
It's never too late.
She went back, she's finishing up her master's at UAB. And so she's teaching. So she and her husband, who is now deceased, had 3 biological children and adopted 1 other child. So they had 4. I had 2 as a single parent. I think when we started dating, I had 5 as a single parent, 2 of whom were adopted and 3 of whom were foster, and she had 4. Actually, at that point, she had 8. Crazy situation. She enjoys
kids running around.
And it was. And so at that point, when we got married, the time we got married, she had the 3 biological and the one that she and her ex-husband had adopted. And then I'd had the 2 that I had adopted, and then we had adopted one together, who was a foster child of mine when I was single, and by the time we were married, was ready to be adopted. So I know that's kind of confusing and crazy.
So 7 total?
7 total, yes.
Kids.
And
Okay.
now we have an 8th that is foster. He is
Okay.
a toddler that is adorable. And he's a toddler, so there are days where he's annoying. I shouldn't say that, but he's a kid.
It's
and,
true.
There's days I'm annoying too.
Exactly.
So we have 8 kind of in the house, and then I don't want to say half a child because he's a whole person. Somebody that I provided foster care to during my time as a single parent, who I've gotten to know his family really well. He's back home, but he still kind of considers himself a part of the family. He does some
That's
traveling
great,
with us and that sort of thing. Kind of the way that my grandparents did it, where it's hey, if you want to show up and be a part of the family, come on.
It's funny, so my dad has kind of this interesting story that when you were explaining all the pieces, it reminded me of his story. He always says he's got, I think it's 8 brothers and sisters, but no brothers and sisters. Technically, he's the only biological from his mother and his father, and he uses, those when you go to a restaurant and you see the sugar packets, and they're different colors, and he uses the sugar packets to explain, well, this is this part of the family, and the pinks are that part of the family, and then we're all one, so it reminded me of that. But it is interesting, especially nowadays, how these kind of blended families all come together.
And I think it's one of the frustrating things with blended families and adoption and foster care in general is there are a lot of challenges that anybody who's done it know about, but they're not brought to the forefront because they don't market well. It's not hey, here's some of the family struggles you'll encounter when you adopt.
Right.
Or hey, here's some of the things that, some ways your life will be majorly impacted if you adopt a child with special needs. Not that it's not worth it or anything, but there are those things that aren't told. And I think when people encounter those challenges and they feel like I call it the Facebook syndrome, where, on Facebook, you see
perfect.
everything the people, you see family pictures. We posted a family picture, a school picture of our family, and everybody, look at those kids, so adorable. And on the picture, they were great.
Right.
And if they could have seen the 10 minutes leading up to that photo,
or right after.
And that's not to say, we have, several teenagers, so our home is interesting.
Right.
But it's to say, there's a loving home, but any situation has challenges. And I think, blended families, certainly notwithstanding, there's always challenges, but I think there's also always benefits.
Right.
But I always try to be honest with people about adoption, about foster care, about adopting a child with special needs or blending families. There are challenges, and there are days that you're wondering, am I doing this correctly?
Right.
Does everybody else have these same problems? And it is. And I transitioning to education, I think that's kind of a problem for teachers. You look at, well, here's, Pinterest, and here's my classroom, and here's how much my kids love me, and all these cards I'm getting. And then you're in the classroom and you see, oh my goodness, my lessons are falling apart, my technology's not working, I have a parent conference here, and you think, well, maybe I'm doing something wrong. Maybe these other teachers are cut out for teaching, and I'm not. And so one of the other things I encourage teachers to do with anybody, but certainly new teachers, and I've been honest with my wife, is look, just because you have a rough day or year or set of years, you're going to have setbacks regardless. If people could see, I'm the teacher of the year, if people could see the setbacks and the failures and the things that I do wrong, they would be like, oh goodness. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some things I feel like I do that are correct and right
of course,
too.
Yeah.
But when you look at, here's this teacher who is adopting children and he's married and his wife's a teacher, and there's so many things behind the scenes that are frustrating. And I do try to be transparent because anybody has those challenges, and I think that's one of the things that causes burnout is teachers see, well, everybody else has got this beautiful classroom and their lessons flow beautifully, and I don't. What's wrong with me? I'm not cut out for this. When sometimes they need somebody to come alongside and say, hey, that was a pretty spectacular failure, but let me tell you about the time that this happened to me, and get them to say, okay, this is common. And again, that's not to say you dwell on those, but it's like the national board thing where you look at those, that lesson flopped. And what can we do to fix that?
Right.
But to realize you're in good company. You know, the old saying, if at first you don't succeed, you're in good company.
Right.
And I think in any profession, that's the case. And I always try to be transparent about, because people look and they say, well, you know, you're a parent and you're an elementary teacher and you adopt and you're interested in mental health and you just look like you have things put together. Not even close.
Yeah,
Not even half put together.
Yeah.
But the image that sometimes is presented is, oh, look, everything's great. And again, I don't want to say that, you know, my life is a dumpster fire, because it's not.
Right.
But, well, there are days. No. But there are challenges. And I think the more that we can be transparent about challenges, certainly in education, but also in adoption, in foster care, in life in general, the better we can understand, hey, everybody else has some of the same problems we do.
Yeah.
Nobody's dinner looks like a gourmet 5-course meal every day. They just happen to post that on Facebook, or maybe there are people who do. But I see these people make dinner and I'm like, my dinner doesn't look like this. that sort of thing.
Well, and I think that transitions us well into a little bit of a talk about mental health, because I think with the social media age, right, you do only see the snippets that people want you to see, in terms of, you know, you see the family photo, you see the 5-course meal that has probably been photoshopped at least a little bit. I mean, my brother's a chef and he's
different
always
filters
like, he's always like, it's amazing how good I can make my grilled chicken look on my camera. Like, this is the before, this is the after. I'm like, oh, that's ethical. No, I'm just kidding. But you know what I mean? Like, there is that sense of like everything's perfect, and I think it lends people to hide a little bit more, even than they used to, you know, from some mental health issues or from some, everything's not perfect, you know, like that's just not a real goal. So talk to me about kind of, you've mentioned mental health passions. What does that look like for you in terms of advocacy and things like that?
So my school counselor, Tanya Kennedy is her name, and she heard it from another conference, but you know, the saying was, in schools, when a child doesn't know how to read, we teach them to read. Mm-hmm. When a child doesn't know how to do math, we teach them to do math. Mm-hmm. When a child doesn't know how to behave, we punish them. And that learning behavior is just as much of an instructional thing.
That's a great point.
As anything else. And I think my passion, you know, starts with looking at the core of the functions of behavior. That all behavior is seeking to fill a need. Maybe it's a need for control in a life where a foster child's been moved to so many different places, they have no control. Yeah. Or maybe it's attention, where, you know, they sit at home, you know, and maybe don't get the attention they could get. Or maybe they're just, you know, I have certain children in my own home who they just love attention. That's just what they do. And so, you know, once you find out what the purpose of that behavior is, then you can meet it. And I'm kind of getting off on a tangent a little bit, but I'll get back to your other question. Fine, yeah. But I want to say that, so my passion starts with helping teachers understand, if you want to impact behavior in the classroom, you have to look at what function is that behavior seeking.
Right, why
a common problem, kids talking out of turn. And, you know, the punishment, I'm not saying, but a punishment I've seen before is not allowing students to talk at lunch, which on the surface makes sense. But if you think about it, you're taking a need that they have to talk.
Right.
And you're taking away another time when it's appropriate.
Right.
And so, and that's not to say that it should never be you, and I can never think of a scenario. I'm sure there's a scenario. But it's getting people used to, you know, or kids who are rambunctious in the classroom. I see, well, that's going to be, you know, you're sitting out of recess today for the entire recess period. And it's, okay, so these are kids who have energy that are trying to express that.
Right.
And again, that's not to say, you know, I've had, you know, kids who have taken a minute or two at the start of recess to kind of sit down and talk with me about what happened or to think about a choice they could have made differently. But framing behavior change as more of teaching. And I think that's where mental health comes in. You know, I teach special education. Well, I teach 4th grade, but my background is special education. And there are certain disabilities that are more visible.
Right.
And that there are, you know, people with Down syndrome tend to look a certain way. They tend to have certain features. One of my children has an amputated arm due to cancer. People think, oh, they automatically see that and go, oh, there's a disability there.
Right.
We have a child who has had to be dragged out of the back of church for cursing at people. That's not, and in some cases, 100%, that is him being defiant and needing to be disciplined. In other cases, it's not.
Right.
And getting people to understand, you don't know what a child's going through. The old, well, just give me 10 minutes with him and I'll straighten him out. That misses the point. And I think so many times, I'm not saying there should not be discipline. I'm not saying there should not be expectation.
Right.
But I'm saying the way to change behavior is to meet the need of the behavior and to show how that behavior that need can be met in other ways.
Appropriately.
And I think,
right.
like you said, mental health, there is a stigma around it because it's not visible. People, and there are people I have seen, I've taught, I'm not going to go into specifics, but people I've seen who maybe it's a little less of a disability and a little more of needing some consistent boundaries at home. I've seen those situations, but I've also seen situations where the child has some problems. The child processes the world differently and needing to be patient with that. And I think that's where, it comes in. And the problem is, it takes a lot of funding to do something like that. We are on I was telling somebody else, we're on our 4th psychiatrist for my child in 2 years.
Oh, wow.
And we've had great ones. We've had really good ones. And they've left for various reasons. One left an organization, for a private practice, and we had the choice of going with that individual.
Right.
One actually is a psychologist for our school system. Fantastic psychiatrist, but they were, focusing on kind of school referred cases.
Right.
We went to Glenwood for services. Great nurse practitioner he saw there that moved on to some other opportunities.
Right.
And now we go to a place in Birmingham with another phenomenal doctor. So, but it's sometimes luck of the draw. It's who you know. It's because of my background in mental health, I know, okay, these are the doctors that are open. This is what to look for in a psychiatrist. Some parents don't know. They're like, my kid may need medication and therapy. I don't know where to go.
Yeah.
Or they go to the first 10 places and they get shut down and they get discouraged because I've done that. When you're on your 4th doctor, sometimes it's like, okay, is this the right situation? Or you get parents who they feel bad asking for help because they're like, it's so overwhelming, you don't know where to look at it. And the reality is it does take, whether rightly or wrongly, I find that, in life, the people who have the most severe needs, whether they be, special needs, physical handicaps, mental, disabilities, developmental disabilities, behavioral disabilities, they tend to take some more resources than some of the others. We have a family of 8. We have one child who is gifted, has taken 6 dual enrollment classes, is taking all AP classes.
Right.
He doesn't need as much of my time invested as somebody else. That doesn't mean that he's not important. He gets the same amount of time per se, but some of the resources and some of the way that looks are different. And I think when we look at a school at equity, at equal sharing of resources, we look at, well, why am I going to spend X amount of money on a physical therapist for 3 kids? Well, because those 3 kids need that. And I think it's raising awareness of, look, when we raise the level of our community, we all benefit. And some of it, and it's society in general, is giving up something that or giving something to a situation that may not benefit you. It may be hard for people, well, why is our money going to mental health? I don't have a child in mental health. Why is my money going to pay for a new performing arts center? My kids don't do art. Why am I going to support the band? My kids don't do band. My kid does band. I have to preface that. but it's hard to see sometimes why resources should go to a place that you may not personally see a need. And so people who see mental health in their face 24/7, they're the people that say, hey, we need the funding. But the majority of people, or the people who maybe don't see it, have some trouble with some of that and say, well, maybe our funding could go elsewhere. And I think that's where that clash comes in. And like you said, nobody wants to be that person to say, hey, I need help. And certainly children grow up and become adults. And adults need, there are certain adults that need, and they're not in a spot where maybe they feel comfortable saying, hey, I need some help. Hey, I need to seek out a psychiatrist for me. How do I do that? That's something that takes a lot of time.
And it's that learned behavior, right? If you learn at a young age, don't ask for help. Don't say anything's wrong. Don't talk about your feelings. You're an adult that doesn't ask for help and doesn't talk about their feelings and doesn't reach out when they need it, and it's hard to break those patterns.
Well, and one thing, I used to volunteer in Birmingham answering phones for the crisis center. And one of the things they said in a training I was a freshman in college, so it was way back, but it stuck with me, was that they said pain is personally defined. And they said that what is painful to an individual may not be painful to another. And so we have to be careful, and I catch myself doing this all the time. A kindergarten kid comes up and says, this person won't invite me to their birthday party, and I get over it, whatever. I have to catch that to say, look, in this moment, that's traumatic.
Very important.
And I don't want to drop the world and say, oh my goodness, we need to, but helping that student say, look, that's frustrating. Let's give him some time. Let's talk to him. Let's go do something else. Let's validate the feeling. You're upset, and that's okay. Let's come back to this later. Rather than get over it. How dare you feel that way? But I think the more that you can validate those feelings and say it's okay, and that's where a lot of that mental health stuff starts. It's okay to be upset. It's okay. It's not socially acceptable to throw a chair out a window. It's not socially acceptable to curse at people. But let's find ways to express that. And I think that the more that we understand that I may be super disappointed that we're in Alabama. I think of sports, and I know that people, there are some people who are probably too close to a situation, but who have a lot of trouble when their team loses.
I'm one of those people.
And I'm one of those people more than I care to admit. But even something like that, the time after the time in crisis is not the time to minimize it. The time after a team is lost, or the time when a kid is upset about a birthday party, or the time when a kid is upset and wants to throw away their paper, that's not the time any learning is taking place. That's where you're focused on, let's deal with the moment right now. And then afterwards saying, hey, so during that football game, you get upset. What are some things we can do preemptively? Or hey, I noticed that your friend, this is how you acted last time when your friend didn't want to play with you. So do you want to play with him now? What are you going to do if he's getting them to prepare for that? The old a special ed attorney who's very well known in Birmingham, who I really like, I think he shared a meme on his Facebook post, and he says, never in the history of calming down, or never in the history, it was something like, never in the history of the universe has a person calmed down by being told, calm down. And so it's in that moment is not the time for the lessons and the lectures. That's the time for the damage control. But then afterwards is the time for kind of rebuilding that bridge and reestablishing that connection.
It's interesting, that point that you brought up. What was the pain is?
Pain is personally defined.
Pain is personally defined. So it's interesting you say that. I was meeting with my therapist recently, and she said, because a lot of people do tend to do, well, my life's not as bad as that person, so I don't need help, And she said, if your big toe hurts, like, that sucks, and your big toe hurts. And if your next door neighbor got shot, like, that sucks really bad, but your big toe still hurts, you know? So it doesn't, I think too many people, again, have that stigma of asking for help, or my life's not as bad as someone else, so at least I have food on my table, so I can't complain, So how do we get rid of that stigma? I mean, there are people I've been talking about mental health for years, and you've done advocacy, and there are people around the world that have, and there still seems to be that, I'll go to the doctor if my leg's broken, but I'm not gonna go to the doctor if I'm depressed.
Well, I think part of it is just setting up information campaigns. Like, you hear about people, there was a problem, same thing with a heart attack for a while, where people would say, oh, I have chest pain. And then I remember for years it was, these are the signs of a stroke or a heart attack. Get help. I think campaigns for when you feel, and you want, like, the pushing things like the crisis center, these numbers that are like, look, there's no commitment, you're not committing to talk to a therapist, it's free. You're talking to somebody who can listen, who can, maybe help you think through some things you're dealing with, and that's it. And if that's all and because I feel like once the foot gets in the door, it's easy to open the door. But it's kind of, and so helping people understand, I would say, encouraging people, if you feel like this is an issue, talk to somebody. There was, I was on medication as a child. I'm not anymore. There's debates that my energy level maybe could use some medication. But, as an adult, I met with a therapist, with a psychiatrist, and we kind of came to an agreement that maybe that wasn't quite where we should look at this time. But I would say, certainly make that first talk, make that first connection, because typically I find that once people do, once they talk to somebody and they see the world didn't end, it's okay. Nobody's, like you said, I love that example of, I may have a broken arm, or a broken toe, and somebody gets shot next door. That's great. My arm still needs to be in a cast.
Right.
I can't walk around and say, well, it's okay, my neighbor got shot.
Right.
Yes, that's horrible. And I'm saying, yes, in triage, that should be taken care of first.
That's horrible, of course.
And the emotional effects and the physical effects. But the person who, they're still going to need it splinted. They're still going to need, and so I think getting people to understand, that doesn't mean there's something, first of all, there's something wrong with all of us.
Right.
None of us are
perfect.
But to say, look, just give, the old, what you do with a kid when they don't want to try a new food. And I'm not comparing mental health services to a new food, but the whole try it, you'll like it.
Right, just try it.
Like if you go and talk to somebody, or if you feel like that therapist isn't working for you, I tried a therapist years ago. One more, try one more.
Right.
Or
it's like a second opinion at a doctor.
And if you're not comfortable face to face with somebody, call one of those 1-800 numbers where you'll talk to a person who doesn't know you, doesn't know your situation, knows your first name, and you can just talk and say, hey, this is what's going on. I need to speak to somebody about what's going on. And I think the more that we get people to understand, the better we are. Now, I think the other thing that goes with that, like you said, is being genuine. Yeah. Being open. We ask people all the time, how's your day? And we're hoping they say good, because we don't want to hear if it's
we don't actually want to know.
But if we want to know, like, hey, if you want to talk, let's talk. Let's be honest about what's going on behind closed doors. Let's be honest about my life's not perfect. There are things I deal with, and there are those posts that are circling on Facebook a little bit about, hey, I deal with mental health, or hey, making it a safe space to be. And hey, look, this is my life, but this is my Facebook life, but there's a life over here where there are challenges, where I can relate to a lot of things that you're dealing with, and find like-minded people. Find people who have some of the same problems. We see success with addiction because we put people together who have some of those same problems, and there's not judgment, there's not one person being better than anybody. They come, they come together and they admit, hey, we need help. What can we do to help? Getting people together. If your parent, special needs parenting groups, one of which I was looking at starting, and then this all happened. But getting people together to say, hey, look, this is a group for parents. We're not going to judge you. When you have that problem, you're that parent that the school calls and you're,
right.
Let's talk about strategies that work. Let's talk about psychiatrists. Let's talk about how do you find a caseworker? When you transition to adulthood, what do you look for in a residential treatment program? Should your child need that level of care? Those things that somebody with addiction to alcohol may not connect to.
Right.
Somebody with a problem with obesity or overeating may not connect to.
Right.
So I think it's to find, I think it's, again, to try it, you'll like it approach, being open and genuine to people's problems, and then trying to get people connected with people similar to them.
Yeah.
If you have a problem because somebody that committed suicide, and that's causing you a lot of depression, then we need to be better, and society as a whole, about here's our group for that. Here are people you can connect with who don't know exactly what you're going through, but have been through a similar event and can explain how they felt, how it impacted them. I always say, I've taught mental health for a long time. I started in Moorhead, Minnesota, working with challenging students. I thought I understood it as a teacher. I was a teacher, I was a mental health professional, I'd read the research, I had it. I'd worked in residential facilities, and I'm telling you, nothing prepared me for dropping off one of my personal children at a residential treatment center, at a psychiatric hospital.
Right.
And that level of feeling, well, am I a failure? Is this the right thing? Am I going to be judged? Am I a bad parent? Is that person going to feel like, all those things that I had done it, I had worked it, I had taught it.
Right.
Until you've done it, you can't. And so to get parents together for, hey, I've been through that. I tell, people all the time, again, I really thought I empathized with those people who had to drop their kids off in facilities, and I tried to be open and understanding, and that was important. But doing that myself, there was a level of, I never got it.
Right.
It never clicked. And so I think putting people together to say, hey, here are people who have the same problems, the same struggles, the same, difficulties that you have and have been through some similar things. You're not by yourself. And I think that's the other thing. Nobody's mental health at times can feel like a very lonely place where you're kind of by yourself, you're in an island. And social media can also be a benefit for that. Because if there's something, hey, there's not very many people who have had a foster child who has committed suicide from, there's certain specific circumstances where maybe in the immediate 100-mile radius, there may not be a ton of people, but there's a group of people who can relate to that. There's a group on Facebook that I follow for my son who has the amputated arm that focuses on the problems that people who have amputations face. I can't imagine that. Right. I can try and empathize with my son and see what he goes through. Right. I physically cannot speak to him as somebody who's done it. And so I think people being open to say, hey, this is what I struggle with. Will this help somebody? And that's for me, my kind of Teacher of the Year platform. I feel like I have a year to say, hey, here's my passions. Here's where I've succeeded. Here's where I failed miserably. Let's see, you're in good company if you've done both. If you have a child with mental health, if you have a child you've adopted from care, or if you're trying to figure out, we've got children now who are transitioning to adulthood, who are going to need longer term options for care. And so how do we navigate that? All these things that don't necessarily show up on a Facebook post, but are important.
Yeah, and I think, like you mentioned, it's really important for people to find their safe space, whatever that is, whether it's a Facebook support group, whether it's a friend, whether it's a therapist, finding that place where you can just be your authentic self. Because in a day and age of social media, it's hard to be your authentic self. Very often.
No, I agree. I love that. Find a place you can be you. And I think the other thing is take time for you. This is going to sound really odd, but there was, I don't want to throw around the word depression because that's not correct, but there was a lot of sadness and emotional, like school started this year and I wasn't teaching. And I see all these beginning of year pictures and I define myself as I'm a teacher. This is what I do. And so for me, it was, and again, I don't want to say that it was anything clinical, but there was a part of me missing.
Yeah.
Like, oh my goodness, all these kids are starting school, and yes, I have other opportunities and things I'm doing, but I'm missing this. And so I think the thing that I've learned is, like you said, be you. Find things that make you you. My job, while important to me and a big part of who I am, isn't all I am.
Isn't who you are.
And so find those things that make you happy. For some people, it's running. For me, it's not running.
Not for me either.
It is. Some people, they exercise and it helps. I used to be able to lift weights and it would help. I play the piano. I love the piano.
I was going to ask you about the singing. I saw one of your videos with you singing.
So I love to sing. I love to play. And so for me, that's how I express myself. When I'm angry, when I'm happy, I love to sit down at the piano. I love to sing songs. And that for me is how I get it out. Some people it's basketball. For some people it's video games to a degree. You don't want to get sucked in, but there are times when I'm like, hey, I'm going to go play some NBA 2K20 on my the Xbox, and I'm just going to play a game, and I'm going to set myself back from that. Sometimes, I'll be honest, sometimes, and again, within reason, it's kind of like the video game thing. I love food. Hey, I'm going to go buy Dairy Queen. I'm going to get an ice cream.
Yeah.
Again, it can't be an everyday thing, but you know, finding those things, what brings you joy, and again, and surrounding yourself with people that are similar, that can relate to. Hey, I know what that's like. My wife is. She's student teaching, which she's student teaching and she's employed. So because she's working on her master's, she's a full-time teacher while she's finishing up. What a year to be trying to learn education. God,
I can't imagine.
And so, but they have a support group where people will panic email, where people will call and say, hey, what do I do? How do I? And they support each other and they say, hey, that's important, really in anything. Yeah. But I think in mental health, that's just as important to say, hey, I've got things that I'm struggling with. What can I do? How can I come to the table and be of help?
Absolutely. So before we wrap up, you kind of alluded to this coming year, and you're missing teaching, and you're not sure. Obviously, with travel, it's hard, and everybody's got different restrictions, and schools are closed, and some are open, and some are 2 days a week, and it's crazy years. So what do you kind of imagine this next year to look like for you?
Oh, goodness. This is like that, everybody who answered that, where do you see yourself in 5 years question 5 years ago got it wrong. I'm sure I'm going to get it wrong.
And with COVID, I mean, you could say something and tomorrow will be completely different.
I think for me, I view this as trying to take as many opportunities as I can, because I'm not going to have this year again. Like, this is not something that I can do again. So it's while I'm here, using my voice to try and make those changes. I don't know anything about blogging, but I'm wanting to start, a short, maybe weekly blog or two, just to say, hey, here are some thoughts on parenting. Here are some thoughts on teaching. Here are some thoughts on mental health awareness. And so for me, I have a platform now that I don't have otherwise. It's funny, I'm saying the same things I was saying a month ago, but now I have that platform. And so for me, I don't want to waste it. I see this being filled with, like I said, blog posts, talking to people on the street, I won't say on the street, but talking to people in universities, in colleges, talking to parents, maybe if the opportunity presents itself, talking to people in Montgomery, people who make the decisions about resources, and saying, hey, look, what can I bring to the table? What does my experience bring? And so for me, it's just not wasting it. The old saying, and from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. I don't have great power, but another great book says, to those who much is given, much is required. And so it's like, if this is a year that I've been given to do this, what am I doing to make this a good investment for the state of Alabama? The state of Alabama said, we want you to be our spokesperson this year. What am I doing to get that voice out there and to make them not say, oh, well, we just kind of, picked you and then you didn't really do anything.
Right. That's awesome. And I think lastly, I mean, obviously, our focus is Central Alabama, but I think, how do you see Alabama, whether, Central here where we are or across the state, how do we get young people to invest in our community, be more like yourself, right? Like, invest in our other young people, or get involved in an organization, or become an advocate? How do we ensure that Central Alabama keeps growing in the way that we want it to?
I think it starts with, and I'm going to kind of answer it with a teaching analogy, but it's going to apply to either one. And people say, well, how do we get people to teach? How do we get people to impact young people? How do we get people to foster? How do we get people, like you said, to impact communities? And I think it starts with, everybody can do something. And it's finding what is your if you love to paint paintings, then you know what? Find a place. Maybe you want to donate some of your paintings to Children's Hospital. If you know how to cook and you're a phenomenal cook, maybe you want to offer to cook for the Salvation Army. My grandparents used to cook on Thanksgiving and serve, the meals. So I think and that helps people feel good when they feel like they matter. But I think it's, find what you can do. I have people, I could never be a foster parent. Okay, cool. What can you do? Can you collect clothes that your kids have outgrown to donate to a foster parent who a kid shows up on their doorstep that night with no clothes, and they can say, hey, a lot of our clothes, one of our kids almost entirely is outfitted from clothes that people have given to us.
That's awesome.
And so I think it's saying, whatever you've got. My wife loves buying furniture. She loves taking her and buying furniture for foster families, saying, okay, who needs an extra bed? Okay, what needs do you have? Who needs a video monitor because they have a baby? I think it's my wife loves being able to do that sort of tangible thing. Some people mowing lawns, but I think it's what makes you happy? What are you good at? And then thinking outside the box and saying, okay, how does this help people? If you're great at marketing, if you're great at marketing and technology and news, what can you do to make the world a better place? Well, you can have a podcast where you can talk to people about their passions and their skills and maybe say something that might spark something in somebody else. And so I think and that's kind of my philosophy of teaching. I was, my saying that I was quoted as saying before, I don't teach one class of 24 kids. I teach 24 kids who happen to be in a class.
Right.
And I think when you see everybody as, look, you are an individual. What makes you you? Do you tell jokes? Are you funny? Do you play music? Do you like to sing? Are you good at art? Are you good at playing the saxophone?
Right.
Are you good at marketing? Do you have a passion for cooking? I think any of those things, being able to look at, this makes me happy, this is what I'm good at, what can I do in my community?
Yeah.
And it's small steps. I'm not saying you have to start a soup kitchen because you're a great cook.
Right.
But maybe it's, hey, once a month, I'll go down to the kitchen and ask if they need help making something.
Right.
Or, hey, I love to sing. I can't sing everything, but maybe there's a charity auction or they need live music and I can donate, an instrument, or I can play music for free for a foster parent group. Just starting small, because that's how it started. I was literally going to get in to help one child who I taught.
And here you
and
are.
that served as the catalyst for all these other things.
Yeah.
So I think it starts small. For me, it was at the time, I can take in this one child and help this one child.
Right.
Well, then it became another child. Then it became, well, do you want to teach? Well, do you want to, and that would be my advice to people in Central Alabama and across the world. Find what you do, and it's not necessarily better than anybody else's. I'm not saying get a complex of, well, I'm better than you because but what makes you happy?
Right.
What do you want to do? And then find a way to make it happen.
Yeah, and I think it's that idea of, like if everybody contributes a little, if you're trying to raise $5,000, well, if the whole town donates $1, which is nothing, it's $1, and no one's asking you, like you said, don't donate the $5,000 or start the soup kitchen, but just do what you can do.
I read an article about somebody, maybe it was in California, who raised money for their college by there was a penny campaign where he wanted everybody to send him a penny.
That's insane.
Or something, or maybe it was $1. It was something small.
Right.
But he got some crazy amount of money.
Right.
That's how these crowdsourcing works. It's if everybody pays $5. But I think it's like you said, it's not trying to, if you're
Change the
learning,
world.
it's not, oh my goodness, I'm going to jump off the boat. It's, let me put my foot in the water.
Yeah.
And then before you know it, you may be swimming.
Right.
But before you just take that step.
Yeah.
Take that first, that open the door, that try it, you'll like it. Find something, because it feels good to make an impact. I think something else, on another note, Heart Gallery Alabama, that the organization that I adopted Eric through, they have professional photographers who, either donate certain time, and they take professional photos, professional photo shoots for these foster kids to try and get them adopted.
Right.
They have marketing people whose job it is to go around and set up displays, and that's something where I would have said, how can a photographer help foster children?
Right.
Well, that's how they do it.
That's how you do
they,
it, yeah.
the people who put
There's
their
always
video
a way.
packages together, and it's and I'm not saying but photographers can help education. One of our teachers, also a coworker of mine, also takes pictures on the side. So she'll take pictures with Santa, or she'll take back to school pictures for $5 that'll raise money for a new computer or a new, that's thinking out, and I'm not always creative, but it's thinking about what can you do. And I think people will be surprised once that door opens, it's going to fling open, and you're going to be like, oh my goodness, look at all these opportunities I didn't know presented themselves to me.
Awesome. Well, I'm really glad to have met you and gotten to hear about your background and your stories. I think it's what you're doing is great, and I hope that you get to use this year the way that you want to, and that it's not, obviously these past several months have been hard, so I hope they get less hard as we go along.
Absolutely.
So, well, thank you so much for being here, and I will see y'all soon.